Military memoirs, especially those written or recounted firsthand by participants of the Great Patriotic War, carry exceptional value. They contain not only historical truth about the events themselves, but also profound human experience, pain, fear, despair, courage, and hope. One such voice from the past belonged to Ilya Grigorievich Sokolov, born in 1925. His account is neither glorified nor embellished with patriotic rhetoric. Rather, it offers an honest, unsentimental perspective on war, seen through the eyes of an ordinary soldier who, by the whims of fate, found himself at the very epicenter of cataclysmic events. Ilya Grigorievich makes no secret of it. He never eagerly volunteered for the front. By early 1943, when he was conscripted, the initial wave of mass patriotic fervor that had swept across the country in the war's opening months had long since receded. People understood what awaited them at the front lines: death, the horrors of trench warfare, unending hunger, and bitter cold. Far fewer men now stepped forward as volunteers. Most simply waited their turn for the draft notice that would inevitably catch up with every man of conscription age. March 1943 marked a turning point in Sokolov's life. At the time, he worked as a lathe operator, a modest, familiar peacetime trade tied to factory workshops, grease-stained work clothes, and daily routine. That day, he arrived at the military commissariat straight from his shift, still wearing his oil and grime-soaked overalls, unaware that by the very next morning he would be sent to a reserve regiment in Chabarkal. Thus began his journey into the army, not with fanfare, parades, or tearful farewells at his family's doorstep, but with a single step across the threshold of the commissariat and into the unknown. Conscripts were transported to their destinations in freight trains, slow, uncomfortable, and devoid of any semblance of comfort. The train carrying Sokolov didn't stop at a station, but pulled up directly in the middle of a forest. All around stood tall pine trees, and deep snow reached up to the knees. Such a beginning already foreshadowed the many hardships to come. From the woods emerged a limping sergeant, the first figure of military authority Ilya Grigorievich encountered. The sergeant quickly formed the new recruits into formation and led them deeper into the forest. After walking roughly 4 kilometers, the column came upon a strange sight: thin plumes of smoke rising from the earth. These are the entrances to enormous dugouts, temporary barracks for conscripts, each accommodating an entire marching company of about 250 men. Inside, 2-tiered bunks made of rough, unplanned boards lined both walls. At the far end stood a stove. There were no mattresses, blankets, or pillows, only mats woven from birch twigs, serving as makeshift bedding. It was in these conditions that the soldiers were expected to live, sleep, and prepare for deployment to the front. The 3 months Sokolov spent in this reserve regiment became a severe trial. Rations were so meager and of such poor quality that many conscripts rapidly lost weight, grew weak, and became emaciated. Some local lads, unable to endure the hunger and brutal conditions, simply fled back home. Ilya Grigorievich, however, remained. Perhaps discipline held him, perhaps inner fortitude, or maybe simply the grim acceptance of inevitability. Upon completing his training, Sokolov was assigned to the chemical platoon of the 1322nd Rifle Regiment, 413th Rifle Division. There he was trained in deploying smoke screens and the fundamentals of chemical defense. Yet the duties of the chemical platoon turned out to be far broader than they might have first appeared. First, the chemical troops were required to assist medics in evacuating the wounded and retrieving the dead from the battlefield. Second, they performed the grim but necessary tasks of burial details. Third, they were responsible for escorting the regiment's chemical defense supply train, carrying gas masks, protective capes, ponchos, and other individual protective equipment. And, of course, they were also assigned household duties, from chopping firewood to constructing shelters. It is worth noting that soldiers of the chemical platoon were considered a rifle reserve, to be deployed only in extreme circumstances. However, during the time Sokolov served in this unit, such a situation never arose. Importantly, there were no flamethrowers in regimental chemical platoons. That weaponry was reserved exclusively for specialized Army-level units. One of the chemical troops' key tasks was creating smoke screens prior to an assault. To do so, soldiers had to crawl out onto no man's land, within 250 to 300 meters of enemy trenches, and position smoke canisters along the intended attack axis. The moment the canisters were ignited and smoke began to drift low over the ground, the enemy would immediately unleash fire. Mortars, machine guns, rifles. The soldiers were extremely vulnerable. The Germans could pinpoint a chemical soldier's exact location by the pattern of the smoke trail and deliberately target him. Consequently, casualty rates in chemical platoons were comparable to those in ordinary rifle units. Evacuating the wounded from the battlefield mostly occurred at night. Two soldiers would crawl toward an injured comrade carrying a shelter half, a half tent used as a stretcher, gently lift him. Yet even the slightest movement would trigger agonized screams of pain. The Germans would instantly launch flares, then saturate suspicious areas with machine gun and mortar fire. It was during one such evacuation that Ilya Grigorievich received his first wound. A mine fragment struck his leg. After being wounded, Sokolov spent 3 weeks in a field hospital. Upon returning to his regiment, he was no longer assigned to the chemical platoon, but instead placed in the 1st Rifle Company. His abilities and resolve were quickly noticed, and soon he was selected for junior lieutenant training courses with the 50th Army. When he returned to his original regiment, he received a new assignment, platoon commander of the 3rd Rifle Company, 1st Battalion. This promotion not only changed his status, but also dramatically increased his responsibility. Now, he was personally accountable for every soldier under his command and every decision he made. Yet it also expanded his capacity to act. Though limited to his small tactical unit, a platoon commander could still influence the course of combat operations. The summer of 1944 was marked by the large-scale Belarusian offensive, during which Soviet forces encircled and destroyed major enemy groupings. One such formation was the so-called Bobruisk pocket, an enormous concentration of German troops trapped in a cauldron. While marching along a pre-designated route, Sokolov's company found itself on the highway leading to Bobruisk. The road was clogged with abandoned German equipment. Enemy forces had retreated in haste, leaving everything behind. By command order, the soldiers took shelter in the forest flanking the highway on both sides. They posted sentries, then lay down to sleep, exhausted after a grueling day's march, each man facing the road. But in the dead of night, sudden gunfire erupted. In the darkness, no one could tell where the shots were coming from. Many men fired without even rising from the ground, assuming they were still facing the road, but some had turned over in their sleep. When the order to cease fire was finally given, a tense silence fell, broken only by the groans of the wounded. They lay in full combat readiness until dawn, bracing for an attack. Daylight revealed an absurd, almost theatrical scene. During the night, a German detachment attempting to break out of the encirclement had entered the very same forest. The battle lines of the Soviet and German troops had become hopelessly intermingled. Realizing further resistance was futile, the Germans surrendered. July 1944 brought Ilya Grigorievich his second wound, once again in the leg. After a month in a field medical battalion, he returned to active duty. This time, he was commanding a company, though it numbered barely 30 men, an all-too-common situation toward the war's end, when losses were staggering and reinforcement scarce. In October of that same year, on the Narew River bridgehead, Sokolov sustained his third wound, this time to his arm. His condition was so grave the doctors spoke of amputation. But the young commander, filled with determination, refused the operation. He preferred to risk his life rather than live as a cripple. And he survived. Sustained by sheer willpower and youth, his body overcame the injury. One of Sokolov's final major battles was the fight for Stettin, a city crisscrossed by wide canals, making its defense particularly formidable. Just as it seemed the enemy was ready to surrender, with Germans hoisting white flags and Soviet troops beginning to cross the canals, a sudden, devastating barrage erupted from every type of weapon. The enemy opened fire on their own, surrendering troops and on the Soviet soldiers who had believed in the capitulation. Sokolov miraculously survived. This episode remained etched in his memory as a symbol of war's treachery and human duplicity. The veteran does not shy away from difficult topics. In particular, he recalls interactions with the German civilian population. According to him, Soviet soldiers in his unit behaved honorably in Germany. He asserts there were no acts of sexual violence. The women, whom soldiers referred to as Nimki, a colloquial term for German women, engaged in intimacy voluntarily, though crucially, not without compensation. They exchanged companionship for food, soap, or clothing. It was a form of mutual survival amid total devastation and poverty. He also notes that even in moments of rage, for instance, when one soldier received news that his entire family had been killed by the Germans, retribution remained restrained. That soldier threw grenades into empty houses, not occupied ones. Most residents had already fled westward. As Ilya Grigorievich put it, the Russian man is not vengeful. He is forgiving. On May 1st, 1945, Sokolov's division reached the shores of the Baltic Sea. Combat operations ceased. Soviet troops captured 2 barges, one laden with French wine, the other with provisions, including genuine delicacies. The sergeant, described as sharp and quick-witted, managed to secure abundant spoils for the men. The soldiers were billeted in the barracks of the Rostock Anti-Aircraft School, magnificent buildings originally constructed for the Kaiser's army. There were oak tables, faience dishes, hot meals, and, for the first time in years, the simple luxury of removing one's boots, undressing down to undergarments, and sleeping peacefully. After months or even years spent in mud, freezing cold, and under constant bombardment, such conditions seemed like a fairy tale, especially paired with French wine. The men sat at tables, drinking wine, eating delicacies, and, above all, savoring every hour and every minute of life. They understood. For them, the war was over, and they would live. Ilya Grigorievich Sokolov's story is not merely a chronicle of military operations. It is a profound human portrait. It tells of an ordinary young man, a lathe operator by trade, who became a company commander, wounded 3 times yet surviving against the odds. He never sought glory or aspired to be a hero. He simply fulfilled his duty, despite fear, hunger, pain, and loss. His recollections remind us that war is not only about grand battles and strategic victories, but also about millions of individual fates, each worthy of respect and remembrance. And it is precisely such accounts, sincere and stripped of grandiloquence, that allow us to grasp the true scale of tragedy and greatness endured by an entire generation.